I don't know why I clapped really loud then. That was terrible. Okay, hi. Nice to see you. I'm so sorry about just it's been one of those like nothing works days. So thanks for everyone for being so patient and letting us start 7 minutes late. We're going to finish off yesterday's Auth lecture really quick. It's actually not too much to talk about. And I don't actually want to give you the explicit solution here, because basically what this last part of the Auth lecture about is like, how do we make sessions? And I've been thinking a lot about this because this is one of those things that we've introduced this term where we're like, here's a new concept. And so it's just a new idea teaching it, but it's kind of very straightforward. It's like the problem with like login and register, like if you have like login here and register and then log out, right? If login and register just return, like, remember a JWT is just a way of packaging something. It's a way of taking data and making it tamper proof. So it's like using a JWT for an auth user ID versus just using an auth user ID creates the same software, creates the same kind of design. It's just that one of them's tamper-proof and one of them's not. So what we're going to talk about now is like, how do we actually like, how would you put it? How do we actually solve this problem where, you know, if you just have a auth user ID as the return value, here's the problem. The only way you know how to actually store that data, genuinely, is that when someone tries to register or log in, you simply put a logged in flag on against their like user list. You know, so like if someone here tries to log in with register, I put it there. And then similarly here, if someone tries to log in and we successfully log in, I'll have to do something here where I say, gosh, I don't know. Like I'd have to keep track of the index here. I'd have to be doing something. Oh, like, you know, it gets pretty messy pretty quick too. Like you're like, this particular user's logged in value is equal to true. Do you know what I mean? So it's like on each user you'd be storing a boolean basically that's like, are they logged in or not? And then if you had another route here that was like logout, right? And what does logout take? I don't know if logout's put or post in the spec. I don't remember off the top of my head. But we added logout in iteration 3, right? 2, sorry. It's a post, right? So I got post, and you can see it only takes in a token. So we're going to get some kind of token here from the actual request. And all you do with the token is you would decode it, which like I'm just going to pretend here that from the token we pull, you know, the auth user ID or something equals 5. And you could do this obviously just by decoding it like we did yesterday. Remember how we took the token, we decoded it with the JWT thing, and that's what gave us like the username. So in actual fact, I could probably do this here where I'm like, okay, the token is, we're pulling out the token from all the post variables. Now I'm going to decode that token into some kind of data structure, which, as we know from yesterday, like our data structure for the token yesterday was just like the token I think just looked like this, username something. That's all it was. Yours in the project will be slightly different. So I get my data structure, and then I can say that in this case, the username, which might be the equivalent of like the auth user ID, is going to be there. You know, so that's how I pull the username out of it. So when someone logs out, what I then might want to do is say, you know what, I'm going to loop through all my users for IDX user in enumerate data users. And I'll do the exact same thing that login does, where we just loop through every single user till we find the right one, except we only need to look for the actual username here. Now, remember, the way these are being stored in this particular example is it's just being stored in a list, but I know many of you are storing users in like a dictionary and stuff. So it's like, now what I'd say is user, sorry, I'd say data users IDX logged in equals false. And then I'd say return nothing, because I think that route returns nothing, or is success. It returns is success. So tell me if this makes sense. It's like register and login, if using a user ID, basically say, yeah, this user's logged in. So anytime we get a route request with that auth user ID, with that kind of token that says I'm that user, we just know whether that user's logged in or not. The problem is though, is, you know, what happens under this method is that a user a user over here on device 1, say their laptop, comes along and they say, I'd like to log in. And login goes, yeah, sure, here you go, here's your token. And then a user comes along and say device 2, the same user, maybe it's their laptop now, and they try and log in, and they get a token, right? So, but they're going to get the exact same token because it's just the user ID. So in both of these cases, the token is literally just going to be like username Hayden or something, right? Like that's all it's going to be. Now the problem with this is that if one of them then goes, you know what, I'd actually like to log out now. Logout will return true, like it'll return successful, but we only associated whether a user's logged in or not at the user level. So what that means is that like we're going to set this flag logged in to be false, such that if the first device, the phone, ever tries to access another route, like, you know, channels create, the second it makes the call, our system's going to check if they're logged in or not, and it's going to be like, no, I'm sorry, you can't make this request, please log in. Does this make sense to people? Like, just before I move on, it's like we're just trying to explain that if your token is the user ID, then it's kind of like all devices are logged in or all devices are logged out. You can't really just, have many at the same time. You know, Miguel said some things in the comment too, which is true, which is like, if someone maliciously gets into your account, the problem with an auth user ID is how do you stop that person going ahead? Because, you know, once they get a token for your user ID, there's no way you can kind of stop them reusing it, because like if you have like a valid JWT with the user ID, it's like you can just keep sending that. So someone logs back in and you just keep using it. So what we want to, Owen said, are these two tokens the same? I mean, for the same user, will the token be generated every time as the same? Yeah, so tokens and stuff are just like passwords. Like if you take a payload, right, which is just this like username as Hayden, and you create a JWT with the same secret, you're going to get the same token every time. Now that's not bad. That doesn't create security problems outright, because as we said, JWTs are about making things tamper-proof, not hidden. So, you know, it's not terrible. And Griffin says, so for iteration 2 methods, do we just added them to the existing channel and auth files? Yeah, I mean, so all of the new routes in iteration 2, you can put them anywhere. Like we don't care what you do with them. Like I think the way we talk about it with the tutors is that we've raised the level of abstraction. So in iteration 1, the black box was essentially these like 3 or 4 files with specific functions in those files. Whereas now the black box is basically just an HTTP layer. So like, you know, in reality, like you could have one Python file, 100 Python files, because the actual tests and the interactions with your work are happening at HTTP level. They're not happening on your functions. So with this problem here, how do we solve this problem? And again, I can't show you everything because then I just give it away, but I'll try and tackle it conceptually for you, which is we use a notion of sessions. So when someone logs in, instead of saying like, here's your user ID, we basically give them a session ID, which tries to describe that particular session that they're having. Right, and this is how websites and stuff work. This is how you can be logged into Facebook on your phone, or your laptop, and then you go to a friend's house and you log into Facebook there, you use it for 10 minutes, you log out, and they're treated separately. And in the case of sessions, what typically happens, just again, broadly speaking, is that when someone logs in or registers, you might say have a session list instead. Right? So let's just say when someone registers, you create a session list. And you got to imagine, all a session is just going to be something with an ID. It's something to uniquely identify the session. It could be a random number. It could be a automatically generated number. It will have to be unique because it's some kind of identifier. But it's just a way of uniquely saying, you know what? This particular session is for like this particular user ID. And to make that, I don't know. Let me just do the dumbest form. There's something you should all look into with this, which is if you go Google, and this is just kind of a hint, there's a Python library that deals with UUIDs. You go find that. I'm pretty sure it's in requirements.txt. If it's not, I'll add it though. But this is a library that handles ID generation, pretty standard. But I could make my own function here. I could literally make a global variable called, session ID, started at 0 or maybe 1,000, just as a random number. I'd say, get new session ID. I could make a function to do this, where all this function does is it sets session ID to be global, and it increments it, and it returns session ID. So I can call this in different parts of my code, and it's always just going to give me a unique one because I'm using like a global counter. So what I could say is, you know what? When someone actually tries to register with my application here, I'm going to create a new session for them, right? And I might put it here. I might say like new session ID equals get new session ID. So this will just give me a number. It's literally just a number. Right, nothing fancy about it. It's just an integer. But what I'm going to do is for that user, I'm going to add it to their session list to kind of say, you know what? Every user has a list of current sessions that they're using, right? A list of devices that are logged in, if you will. Like that's all a session is. A session is just a device that's logged in. So I'm going to add that session ID to the session list because if you register, you get logged in immediately. So you already have one session established. And then when I encode my token now, instead of my token being about a username, I'm going to just change this to like say session ID. So all of my token encodes now will just take in a session ID. Like that. New session ID. So it's still a token. It's just like the payload of the token's different, right? Like instead of the payload of the token being a user ID, the payload of the token is a session ID that describes a particular session that you're having. So that's really it. And then when someone calls login, you're going to return them a session ID. Every time they log in, you want to use a unique session ID. So what you might do here is you might say, new session ID. What do we do here? We said we got a new session ID, and then we appended it to session list dot append new session ID. Like that, so, and then we pass this in here. So we're literally just using sessions. I shouldn't have changed this to session ID. This should still be token, sorry, because again, it's like, you're returning a token. You could return an elephant in the payload, but the point is it's a token, right? A token is a JWT with a payload wrapped inside of it. So, and then when someone logs out, similar thing, we would loop through all of the users until we find, well, here's the tricky thing. If someone goes to log out and all you're given is a session ID, right, you're not given the username. So the only piece of information I'm given on the JWT here is the session ID. So how would I figure out who that even is? Like, because in this route, you're obviously trying to remove the session ID, but in other routes, you're trying to figure out who the user is. Well, you kind of have to go, you kind of have to loop through like, okay, for each user in the data users list. Okay. Then you kind of have to loop through each session in the data users index of session list. Data structures can be confusing, obviously, but if you just kind of stare at this for a bit, it'll be okay. And you're basically going through each and every single session, and you say, you know what, is this session equal to, I'll call this one like token session ID. Right? You're like, okay, is this, like, you're looping through all the sessions now, and you're like, is this session ID equal to the one that was given? And if it was, well then, in this case, you know who the user is. You could say logged in user equals user username or something, right? Because like the way the data structure works is, you've got your list of users here. You got like user 1, user 2, user 3, user 4, and all you're doing is you're just looping through all of those, and then you're looping through their list of sessions. Where like you got like session 1, session 2, session 3, and we're just trying to find what we want. So you go through like each of these sessions, and when you find the session you want, if you find it right here, you're like, oh, well, that must be user 4's. And in this case, I'd want to actually remove the session 2. So I'd say, like username. Sorry, I'd say like data users IDX session list dot remove. I can't remember how to remove from a Python list. You get my point. You'd have to play around with data structures a bit, but it's pretty much the same thing. And it's really easy to test too, because all you have to do is create a user, one user, and then you can just log in. Maybe you can use ARC, and then you can use another client, or you don't even need to do that, because in theory, when you call login, you should get a different response every time, right? Because if you call every time you call login, you should get a different session ID in the payload, which will give you a different JWT. So this is probably working if you just spam call login, and the token is just like a different token every time, then there's a good chance it works, which is really good. Xiao Cheng says, I'm confused about the concept we were told yesterday the token is required to be encoded, and we just put session in the token today. Yes, so back to that table. Here, this is how we started for iteration 1. We just stored the user ID in an insecure fashion. And yesterday what we talked about was how do we do it in a secure fashion? How do we pass the user ID around that makes it tamper-proof? And that principle can be applied to anything. And then today, for like 15 minutes, we've talked about, you know what, instead of using a user ID, let's just use a session ID. We already know how to make it tamper-proof. So the JWT, again, it could store a user ID, it could store a session ID, it could store an elephant. It doesn't really matter. It's just a way of making data tamper-proof. So yesterday was, how do we make it tamper-proof? Today was, what do we want to make tamper-proof? Like, what's a smarter thing to make tamper-proof? So yeah, secure is not my favorite word here. Like, I like, again, this is a new slide this year, this term. So, like, secure is kind of true, right? In the sense that it stops people it stops people being able to like hack into your account, but it's not secure in the sense that it doesn't like make your session a secret. But that's not really possible either. So, if I had my way again, I'd kind of say, JWTs mean tamper-proof. So, these bottom row would be tamper-proof instead of secure. But it kind of means the same thing. And Amin says, do we worry about time when it comes to removing sessions, or is it just like logout that removes sessions? Well, that's a good example of a bonus feature you could do for your iteration 3. I think we do bonus features in iteration 3. You could associate a login time or expiry with it if you'd like to. One of the cool things about JWTs, right, is, if I said to you, okay, when someone logs in, I want you to send them a session ID and an expires at, which is maybe like a Unix timestamp or something. And this tells them when does the session expire? As in, if they try and log in with a session ID that's expired, or a JWT token that's expired, will it stop them logging in, right? And without a JWT, you might think that's a terrible idea, because all a user's going to do is tamper with this and change this, and they're just going to make it a really big number so that they can be logged in forever. But again, that's the benefit of JWTs, because if I get my payload and I say, you know what, my session ID is going to be that, and then an expired at is going to be some Unix timestamp, then it's like, cool, okay, you take this token, right? And if I encode it with polywaffle, I take this particular token here. And again, I'll like show you, you can do this pretty easily just playing around. If I just get rid of this and I say, you know what, my secret is polywaffle and my token is that, right? It's just a string, right? JWT is just a string. If I try and decode this token, I will get it, right? Like the JWT library will extract the information from that token. But again, if someone malicious comes along and says, well, I can see that this payload is this, I'm going to tamper with the expired at. But remember, again, they don't have the secret. So like if a user comes in blank, it's like reloading this page. They don't know the secret. So all they do is they paste a JWT in here. You can decode the JWT because it's not hidden, it's just tamper proof. So I can see the payload and then I say, aha, I'll change this. I'll make this, I'll put a 1 out the front. So I have like forever now. So then I take this JWT and I go back here and I say, this is my token now. And watch what the JWT library does. It craps itself. It says signature verification failed, because this blue thing here is the hash of the payload and the secret. And if you don't have the secret, you're not going to get the right hash. Do you know what I mean? It's a little bit like passwords. Like what the JWT library actually does is it takes the secret and it takes the payload and it just like hashes them together and it gets like a signature. And you notice here, see the signature that's like the wrong signature? Like just take note of like what that is. It's like U something. Watch what happens when I put in polywaffle. When I put in polywaffle, we hash the payload and the secret here and we get this thing here. And this is a verified signature, right? So if I was to use this one here instead, now it will work. Oops. Sorry. Now it will work. Little slow. Oh, I don't know. Save. Maybe I didn't save it. VLabs Grumpy. No, you can use ARC on anything. So I'm pretty much going to wrap up this lecture here because obviously, like, you know, we're continuing on from yesterday. But yeah, any massive last questions here about JWTs or sessions? I'll answer 1 or 2 questions. Okay. I know there might be a delay, but you're all so... How do we access ARC without using VLab since we have to be on the same computer? Well, if you do things locally, you'd have to like set up and you'd have to like have Python installed so that you can run Flask locally as well. So like if you can run Flask locally, you can do this locally. Praf says, so for the int2, will we be using session IDs instead of user IDs? Oh, for the iteration 2. Yeah, exactly. So iteration 2 asks you to use sessions instead of user tokens. And that's because when we do testing on your iteration, we will basically try and log in on 2 accounts at the same time. Cool. So that's pretty much it on session.